Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to another video, and welcome back to another video about the Dune novels, Frank Herbert's Dune novels. Just let me get set up here. So this is the third video that I've done about the Dune books. The first two videos I did were inspired by Neema Parvini. Like I did the first video I did was looking at the first three Dune novels through Neema Parvini's Populist Illusion. And then the second video I did was looking at the Dune novels through another one of his books called The Prophets of Doom. And this one is a little different. And you know what? I've just lost my script. Where did I? I just lost my notes. All right, there we go. And so this one, Neema Parvini, who wrote those two books, he also talks about the different types of online criticism, political commentary and political criticism, and he did a video breaking them down into different schools, and one of the schools he called the School of Schizo. The School of Schizo. And the School of Schizo was this sort of wacky outlier in terms of commentary and political analysis. And he said that this is a form of online right criticism that's obsessed with hidden symbols, so sort of cultist hand gestures. And sort of hidden elite puppet masters sort of manipulating world events, and that these School of Schizo people are obsessed with things like the Illuminati, which has apparently been orchestrating world events for centuries. And Parvini calls the people who talk about these things the School of Schizo, as opposed to more realist based analysis. Or people who are more sort of realistic analysis of modern politics. But anyway, so this video is going to be my final Dune video, and it's a School of Schizo video that draws on the work of an American comedian called Kurt Metzger. And in my first two videos about the Dune novels, I talked about, these sort of recurring themes of elite power structures, the deliberate shaping of heirs and bloodlines and children through extreme psychological and physical ordeals. And what I'm going to talk about in this video is how these elements bear some striking similarities to ideas expressed by this American comedian, Kurt Metzger, who has discussed how elites, and everything in this video is alleged, allegedly traumatize their children to induce dissociation and thereby create more detached, resilient, and effective future leaders within these kind of secretive power networks. And of course, Metzger's claims lean into well-known conspiracy theories involving all sorts of rituals and abuse, and what sometimes gets referred to as sort of wizard schools. But in general, he's often talking about things like MK Ultra and this kind of stuff. And just the general elite grooming of children, of their own children, in various, what we might say are sadistic and abusive manners, and the reasons that they do these things. And that these things happening in the real world, this kind of resonates or finds a parallel in Herbert's portrayal of his aristocratic families and organizations like the Bene Gesserit, who are trying to engineer trauma to forge sort of influential leaders and rulers. So I'll try and outline Metzger's sort of concepts based on some of his public statements, and then connect it to the novels. So Metzger doesn't have, in the case of Neema Parvini, he has a couple of books where he outlines his arguments and his research. And Metzger doesn't have any books like that, and if you listen to him speaking, often it's he has more of a kind of stream of consciousness, or a sort of scattergun style approach to talking about things. It can be very amusing to listen to, but he doesn't have like specific videos where he outlines any of his arguments really in sort of condensed or summarized form. And so this is drawn from, I've fairly regularly watched Metzger on. He's a regular guest on the Jimmy Dore show. He has his own podcast. He crops up in things all the time. And so this is, I'm kind of drawing from these different appearances to outline his core arguments. So he's probably most well known for being on the Jimmy Dore show, I think, at this point. But what he is often very interested in is talking about these kind of dark conspiracy theories involving global elites, right? And many of these are real people. And what he argues, I don't mean real people, I mean just sort of well-known people that everybody knows. And what he argues in general is that there are powerful families and institutions, whether it's in politics or Hollywood or whatever, that intentionally subject children to trauma, often their own children. And the type of trauma that they subject their children to are SA, I believe we have to refer to it on YouTube, ritualistic experiences and drug-induced experiences, drug-induced states. And this is done intentionally to cause a kind of psychological dissociation. And this dissociation, he claims, allows these individuals to compartmentalize their emotions, to detach from empathy, and ultimately become more manipulative or effective in maintaining elite control. So, for example, he often discusses this idea of trauma bonding in children in connection with this idea that elites use drugs and abuse to create people, or to turn their children into people who don't feel things in the way that regular people do. And this leads to this kind of dissociated state where they can engage in extreme behavior. And so he'll talk about, can escalate from into all sorts of bizarre and strange fantasies or actions and behaviors due to this emotional numbness. And he talks about this idea of alleged, elite training grounds, and he references, what MK Ultra and Monarch and these kind of things, and talks about sacrifices and child trafficking networks. And he claims that everybody, the children of all of the sort of Hollywood celebrities have been interfered with, let's say, in ways like this, and that a lot of the time this is done intentionally to build this sort of ability to disassociate from things that are happening around you. And it's a kind of structured dissociation, or a kind of trance state, which enables people to behave in ways that maybe other people would resist, or have some sort of moral issue. And he ties this to broader power structures, sort of suggesting that trauma is used to create leaders who operate, in a way that is detached from the kind of regular moral constraints that most of us might have. And these ideas kind of echo, fringe conspiracy theories about intergenerational elite grooming. Metzger often mentions the work of Carol Quigley, in particular his book Tragedy and Hope, which talks quite openly about these kind of small groups of elites grooming other elites for roles and all sorts of things. And again, the core idea here is this notion that this dissociation enhances the ruthlessness for ruling roles, and so the elite do it to their children intentionally. And of course, I don't know if this has been proven at all, and it's very controversial, but it does provide us with a very interesting lens to examine the similar dynamics which we can see in Dune. So Herbert's universe in the Dune novels is built on elite bloodlines and organizations like the Great Houses, Atreides, the Harkonnens, the Carinos, and we have organizations like the Bene Gesserit. And what we see in the Dune books is this systematic traumatizing of heirs to unlock enhanced abilities, and often in these sort of induced dissociated states to enable superior leadership. And this, mirrors Metzger's claims, and he's mentioned the Dune books a couple of times. The trauma is intentional. It's aimed at creating detached rulers who can wield power without emotional hindrance, but it risks madness, or what's referred to in the Dune books as abomination. And it manifests in slightly different ways across the trilogies. Let's start with the first Dune book. And so Metzger has actually mentioned the Gom Jabbar test that we find in the first Dune novel. So in this first book in the series, the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, who are the secretive elite order who want to manipulate the galactic politics, and they want to do this through breeding and sort of psychological manipulation. And they subject the potential heirs of these families, these powerful families, to a kind of ritualized trauma. And they do this intentionally to foster this dissociation-like state. And this kind of enhanced developmental conditioning is designed to produce leaders with sort of trance-like control and detachment. And this is where the Gom Jabbar test comes in. So the young Paul Atreides, in this sort of famous and iconic scene, he is forced to endure this excruciating pain via this sort of poison needle box. And this is designed to test his ability to see if he can override his instincts and remain or be rational and detached from these sort of very real feelings that he's experiencing. And the Reverend Mother from the Bene Gesserit explains it in a way as kind of separating humans from animals. But essentially, this is inducing this kind of dissociated state where pain is compartmentalized. And this trauma unlocks Paul's latent or inherent abilities and makes him a more effective ruler in training. And the Bene Gesserit, so what we see here is that they're explicitly using trauma to desensitize heirs, right? And the Gom Jabbar test it kind of is an example of this, right? He's forced to endure this excruciating pain, and the penalty if he doesn't pass this test, is death. And so he kind of has to override the instinctual panic through this mental discipline and detach from his physical body, and to prove that he's elite capable, he's human rather than an animal who's driven by base reactions, right? So the rest of us are just animals. We are not these elite capable people who can detach from the things that our body is telling us, right? He can rise above this. And the Reverend Mother sort of suggests that this is a weeding out of the weak to create rulers who can make the cold and calculated decisions that they need to without emotional interference. We also have this idea of these sort of spice trips or spice experiences. So Jessica, who is Paul's mother, but also a member of the Bene Gesserit, she exposes herself and Paul to these spice ordeals where they sort of gain access to ancestral memories. And this is a kind of induced dissociation where the mind hosts all of these different voices and experiences. And this sort of trance state enhances Paul's and Jessica's strategic thinking, but burdens the psyche and perhaps kind of foreshadowing a sort of elite overreach. And this, kind of almost ritualistic overdosing on this spice substance, it forces the initiates like Lady Jessica to confront these, traumatic floods of memories. And you gain this prescience, but it's at a cost of a fragmented identity. Your ego is sort of forced to go through this kind of induced collective trauma. And Paul's visions in this state detach him from his humanity, and this enables him to become this kind of messianic leader who unleashes this jihad. And the billions of people die, and he's kind of detached from it, right? He just sees it as the path that, or arguably just sees it. This was the path that happened, that needed to happen, that was going to happen. And so we see Herbert portraying this kind of elite engineering of trauma being used to create effective rulers by breaking and rebuilding the psyche of the individual through these kind of experiences. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Kurt Metzger talks about: the use of pain and ritual to build special talents, like the voice for mind control. The Bene Gesserit use the voice, this almost sort of hypnotic ability to influence people. And Paul's early traumas, I mean, he's still essentially a child in this first book. This detaches him from normal empathy and prepares him to be this leader who unleashes this awful jihad. And this sets up the cycle. We see that trauma creates effective elites, but it also sows the seeds of future instability, right? The dissociation is good for creating effective rulers, or for a while at least, but it also has this potential for instability. Moving into Dune 2, Dune Messiah, we see the burden of the dissociation. So the sequel shows Paul how this sort of trauma-induced dissociation has made him a detached emperor, and it's trapped him in isolation and regret. Right? We see here the cost of this kind of elite grooming. So Paul has these spice-enhanced visions, but they've basically put him into a perpetual dissociated state. He sees all the paths, but he feels completely detached from humanity. He just views people as pawns. And this is a very Metzger kind of idea of elites not feeling things and enabling ruthless decisions, like allowing atrocities to happen. And of course leads to emotional numbness, and for Paul, even suicidal ideation. And we also see that Metzger sometimes talks about the use of drugs and rituals for this kind of dissociation. And we can absolutely 100% see that in the way that they use the spice as this kind of tool for this sort of structured experience of dissociation. And Paul's rule exemplifies how trauma makes leaders effective, but kind of pathological, right? He's detached from the consequences of this awful mass kind of genocide that's happened in his name across the galaxy. If we move into the third book, so Children of Dune, and this book, this is about inherited trauma. This book is really an exploration of generational trauma, where the children of the elite are pre-traumatized to ensure a kind of continuity, and with the possible result that this might lead to a full-blown dissociation, or what they call abomination in the books. So Paul's children, Leto and Ghanima, are pre-born due to the use of spice when they were pregnant. And this means they're born with the full range of their ancestral memories in their brain already. And so this is a kind of dissociated multiplicity. They have literally thousands of inner voices. This leads to the risk of possession, abomination, and their auntie Aliyah, she succumbs to this abomination and is possessed by one of these ancestral egos. And we see that this possession leads to extreme paranoia and sort of tyrannical behavior. The Leto, the child example, is very interesting. He goes through another kind of, he endures this other sort of awful physical and psychological transformation, because he merges with the sand trout. This is a kind of intentional dissociation, right? He really completely detaches himself from humanity through his choice there. And again, this parallels this Metzger's idea of traumatizing children, so they dissociate. for these kind of elite roles. And okay, yeah, and the Atreides Gesserit program uses this kind of trauma, like through the spice and the rituals, to create leaders who have they go into these kind of trance states. They're detached, but it backfires in the case of Aliyah. And for Metzger, he talks about the political elites and Hollywood elites and so on. That finds a parallel in Herbert's families grooming their heirs through these abuse-like ordeals for power, and in these sort of perpetuated cycles of dissociation and control. So in the Herbert books, the first 3 Dune novels, Herbert is sort of showing or critiquing how elites, the Bene Gesserit, the Atreides, and so on, they view trauma as a tool for effective leadership. This kind of dissociation enables prescience, enables the use of the voice, enables strategic detachment, but it has this possibility of abomination, right? The literal fragmentation of personality. And this is something that that Metzger has picked up on. The elites use trauma to build resilience and manipulativeness, but it comes at a very steep human cost. It sometimes can go wrong. It's often tied to rituals like these kind of Bene Gesserit Gom Jabbar tests, or networks, which we might say are eugenic kind of networks or breeding programs. And across the first 3 Dune novels, we see these connections to elite permanence, traumatized heirs that are used to ensure a dynastic continuity, or to try and ensure dynastic continuity. But there's always this potential that they might end up in tyranny and decay. The trauma doesn't always succeed, as it were. It can lead to abomination and madness. And, maybe Herbert is critiquing the hubris of such engineering. Yeah, right. So that we can, and, Metzger is using this as looking at these things through a more conspiratorial lens, but definitely seems like Herbert was aware of some of the similar things. I wouldn't be surprised if Herbert had read Carol Quigley, for example. Herbert is Metzger is drawing from all of the conspiracy lore around, like, MK Ultra, mind control, Monarch, and all of that kind of stuff, right? And it really does seem that Herbert was drawing on similar sources, right? So the parallels are actually quite uncanny, but it's super interesting. And of course, I think Dune just has this continued relevance as a critique of power and the dark underbelly of power. Ghanima, do I need to talk about that? I think I was going to talk about Ghanima, but I think you kind of get the idea, right? Like, is there anything different? So Ghanima is Leto's twin sister, and so she's kind of like a successful example of trauma being used on a child, right? So she, where Alia goes insane, right? She succumbs to the trauma that she's been forced to experience, right? But Ghanima maintains mastery. She has been through this kind of early life trauma, drugs, and the spice drugs, and she's born with these ancestral memories. But she manages to control. She can sort of go in and out of the dissociated state as she needs to, and she sort of maintains mastery through this sort of self hypnosis and extreme mental discipline. She can suppress these unwanted voices. She sort of creates this other persona that is sort of aware but detached. And so she can function as a strategic thinker and survivor and ruler. She survives assassination attempts. She manages to fake her brother's death. convince people that she believes he's dead, and she sort of navigates all the court intrigue without emotional breakdown, despite going through all of these extreme experiences. And so she is, her sort of trauma has made her extremely resilient and calculating. She can compartmentalize her grief. She can manipulate perceptions, and she doesn't fracture the way that Alia fractures. And again, this is kind of a Metzger idea of trauma producing these sort of pathological personalities who don't feel things, right? So, and Ghanima is completely detached from ordinary human limits. So, whereas Alia is a bad example of this sort of process, Ghanima is a good example of what you can hope for. Ghanima is like the Ghislaine Maxwell of the Dune books. I forgot to put that in actually. So I was going to talk about Ghislaine Maxwell's relationship with her father. I've read a biography of Maxwell, and I read the two Whitney Webb books about the sort of Epstein network. And Ghislaine Maxwell was both her father's favorite child, apparently, but also was extremely he was extremely controlling, that he was interested in controlling her boyfriends, like, who she was dating. And when she was a young child was, really quite abusive towards her. And of course, many people think that she sort of picked up his, network that he was working for after he passed away. And so it's kind of interesting, right? Ghislaine Maxwell is Ghanima, right? She went through all this awful abuse and became this sort of high level operative that can compartmentalize in all sorts of different ways. Anyway, I had a little bit more to say about that. There was a few other things that I was going to mention in this, but I think it's long enough already. Anyway, okay. So yeah, so Herbert is talking about these similar kind of things, right? Ghanima avoids full abomination, right, through discipline and self-control, and so she has been groomed perfectly, and she's a successful example of this kind of grooming, right? Whereas Alia is a bad example, right? But the cost is obviously immense for Ghanima, right? She lives in this sort of constant state of mental tension. She has to constantly rework her self-awareness under stress, and her life is shaped as well by this need to preserve the bloodline, right? Because at the end of the it doesn't matter, but anyway, so there's a long-term psychological problem for even though she's the successful version of this, it's not a great situation for Ghanima, but she is the successful outcome. She's detached enough to be effective, but still human enough to appear human to other regular people. So in a way, Ghanima kind of embodies the elite grooming cycle more than anyone else, right? She's been through the trauma. She's capable of ruling the empire. She's still in control of herself in a way. And so here we kind of see this sort of generational conditioning for power, right? The successful version of it. Let's move on to the next thing, right? So the other aspect of the Bene Gesserit that I want to talk about, this is also coming from Kurt Metzger, and this is about the speculation about Melania Trump being potentially groomed and introduced to Donald Trump by Jeffrey Epstein as a means of elite control. And we can find a parallel here, of course, with the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. And, Metzger, on these various rambling podcasts that he goes on, he suggests that the Epstein network, known for trafficking and blackmail and connections to various powerful people, may have functioned like a Bene Gesserit style grooming operation where attractive women like Jessica, who's given to Leto, these kind of trained women are put into positions to influence high profile leaders. And Metzger has explicitly compared this to the Bene Gesserit, who do exactly this, right? They're this secretive matriarchal order that breeds trains and strategically deploys women as concubines and wives to manipulate political leaders and bloodlines for the long-term galactic control of the Dune universe. So I'll try and sort of summarize Metzger's comments here, but again, it's kind of all over the place, right? And of course, this is completely speculative and alleged, and I, just commenting on this comedian's, out there conspiracy theories. So what Metzger argues is that, again, this idea that the elites use trauma and grooming and also strategic introductions to embed agents of influence in powerful circles. So in the case of Melania Trump, he suggests that her modeling career in the 90s or earlier, which overlapped with Epstein's operations in New York, could have been a vector for such a placement. So Epstein, who was a convicted, SA offender with ties to various billionaires and politicians and celebrities and so on, allegedly used his various modeling agency connections through one of his other associates. There was a guy called Jean-Luc Brunel, who to recruit these young women, many of whom or some of whom were allegedly trafficked or positioned for leverage over powerful people. And Metzger has speculated that Melania's introduction to Trump at I think he said, or I think it was at a 1998 New York Fashion Week party hosted by a guy called Paolo Zampoli, who was a modeling agent with apparently some connections to Epstein. And this introduction might not have been coincidental, but a kind of deliberate introduction or control mechanism to ensure influence over Donald Trump. Metzger connects this to this idea of dissociation from trauma, and claims that this kind of grooming creates detached individuals, right, who can be put into these sort of situations without having kind of emotional baggage. And he has, compared it to how, cults or secret societies like the Bene Gesserit and Dune condition women for roles in these kind of elite marriages. And this, fits in with, Metzger's broader analysis that elites use sex and drugs and abuse to traumatize and dissociate their participants, and therefore making them effective tools for influence. And Melania, potentially, if you look at her background or rapid rise in modeling, could indicate such grooming. And, she was arguably positioned to be the wife of some powerful person, and in this case, it was Donald Trump, to subtly steer or monitor him. And of course, there was a friendship between Epstein and Trump, and they kind of socialized for a long time, right? In the Herbert books, the Bene Gesserit, they're an all-female organization, but they kind of operate as a shadow elite, and they influence the sort of galactic Dune universe through similar strategies, right? They select and train and place women, often as lovers or partners or wives, with these powerful men to control bloodlines and politics and just power in general. And the grooming involves the sort of young age selection, early trauma. They're subject the girls who are chosen. They're subjected to this kind of rigorous and conditioning and training. And they're as initiates, they learn this kind of the sort of prana, mind control, mind body mastery. They learn the use of the voice for the sort of hypnotic command. They learn seduction techniques. They're encouraged to foster this emotional detachment. And this allows them to compartmentalize trauma, to experience and see all sorts of awful things, to manipulate without empathy, and serve the Bene Gesserit's goals, right? And this is this strategic placement. The Bene Gesserit candidates are assigned to leaders for influence. So Lady Jessica is given to Duke Leto. and specifically to bear an heir. And in this sort of behavior, we can see that the Bene Gesserit embody this kind of elite control. They use these marriages and relationships as tools for long-term power, right? And they don't care about this sort of extreme trauma and disassociation that occurs. So I think the Metzger comparison here to the Bene Gesserit, it kind of works as a metaphor, right? We can see Melania Epstein as a real world analog to Lady Jessica and the Bene Gesserit. They're where women are groomed and introduced to powerful men for elite influence. The Bene Gesserit really scout talent young, they subject them to trauma, and then they pass them on to these powerful guys, and they use them to influence. And wasn't that what Epstein was doing? Recruiting these young models who often start at 14, 15, 16. They use these kind of parties and promises of big modeling jobs and so on. There's trauma, exploitation, abuse. They're made pliable for placement. And then they end up married to the future president of the United States. And anyway, so is Lady Jessica the Dune equivalent of Melania Trump? It is a kind of interesting way to think about the Dune novels, right? And these placements are about ensuring bloodline control, right? And I think we can see some parallels there too, right? So of course, this is all completely speculative. And it's the Bene Gesserit is a fictional organization about eugenics and secret societies. It's not a real thing, but it really seems like Herbert was drawing on some very quite maybe specific things that he was aware of. And I do think the parallel works metaphorically. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, that's one last thing I want to talk about in terms of Kurt Metzger and the Dune novels. So the other thing that he talks about is that the elite remain obsessed with their bloodlines. So this idea of the bloodline is still very much an important thing among the modern elite. So, and that this functions as a kind of a mechanism for maintaining what they even think of themselves as a kind of divine claim to power. And it's often tied to secret societies, in Metzger's arguing, inbreeding, and again, this kind of intergenerational control. And in Metzger's reasoning, or Metzger's arguing, he describes the elites as obsessed with their lineage, obsessed with their bloodline, and that they view it as a kind of divine right that separates them from the masses, and which enables this sort of unchecked authority and this vast and often hidden wealth. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, this obsession with their bloodline, that they've got a divine right to do this or that. When you hear people talking about their divine right to effing kill you or whatever, there's your problem. And then he kind of links this to the persistence of royalty. Why do we have any kings at all? He asks. Inbreeding, he says, and again, paraphrasing, the elites are so effing inbred. Sorry. That's probably why they look like effing reptiles. And of course, he's always talking about these kind of secret societies like the Freemasons or the Illuminati. And he sees these groups or, royalty as perpetuating these sort of bloodline-based hierarchies. And this, Metzger argues, it's not an archaic thing, but it's still very much ongoing. You're told this isn't important for you, for the plebs, for the nobodies, but the elites are still very much concerned with their bloodline and with grooming successors and exerting control through culture networks. You're sort of conditioned by all the crappy media and so on, and all the academic, garbage in the universities, that not think about these things, to not think that this is important, but the elites themselves think that this is absolutely of key significance and importance. And again, it is something that we absolutely see in the Dune novels, right? Bloodline obsession is central to the elite power dynamics in these books, right? And one strain is through this the Bene Gesserit sort of centuries long breeding program, which is aimed at producing the sort of very specific heir. They're thinking about genetics for prescience and control, right? They're very much thinking about, it's a kind of eugenic project, really, right? The noble houses like the Atreides, the Harkonnens, the Corrinos, they intermarry and they manipulate their lines to preserve their political dominance and their elite positioning, and they view blood purity as an essential thing for authority and survival. And Metzger argues that the elites who are still very much in charge today, they're sort of obscured and hidden, but that they are still extremely concerned with this idea of blood purity, like racial blood purity and their own, family line blood purity. So again, super interesting idea. And of course, there are observable concerns with bloodlines among elites that we can see historically. They might be a little bit more subtle than in the Dune novels, but think of like the royal and aristocratic families, the European monarchies, the Windsors in England or whatever. They prioritize their bloodlines, or I guess maybe they kind of do, or like the Saudis and Jordanian royals. We have political dynasties in the U.S. You have the Kennedys, the Bushes, the Clintons. This is kind of American royalty. You can see intergenerational grooming there, like George Bush following his father. You can see it, in India, there's sort of family dynasties that kind of dominate politics as well. So you do have these kind of family dynasties that are still very much influential. Historically, we have there's like conspiracies around like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and how they used marriage to protect their fortunes and develop their influence. And what Metzger talks about, that this is sort of used by the elites to in a way to obscure their power and influence. And they still view it as extremely important. You're told that it's not important, and that you don't need to think about that, but for them it's sort of paramount importance, right? And that this idea of eugenics is still very much a priority for the ruling elite, right? And we can see this parallel in Dune in the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, right? And so I think that's an interesting thing to think about, right? Bloodline concerns, how this relates to the continuity of power. I think it's interesting to think about. Anyway, okay, I think I'm going to wrap up there. I really think I really think that Frank Herbert kind of knew, what was going on, or he just seems to understand a lot of these things that just seem to be true, or that increasingly, as more and more things come out, that just seem to be kind of accurate, right? It really seems like Frank Herbert was just aware of a lot of these things, or he was thinking about them, which is super interesting, right? Considering when the books were written. I think if we look at the Dune books through these kind of lenses, like in this video and the past two videos, you really do see, they're cautionary tales that do have this uncanny or eerie anticipation of these sort of shadowy movements of power that people like Neema Parvini in one way, or someone like Kurt Metzger describe. I mean, Kurt Metzger describes things in a bit raw, more unfiltered way, but you can absolutely see these things in Frank Herbert, right? You in the Bene Gesserit sort of calculated traumas, the Atreides, like their concern with the bloodline and how they use this sort of engineered dissociation and trauma, the perpetual obsession with genetics and genetic control and control of the dynasty, the way that intentional suffering is used, that like the spice and the gom jabbar, how these kind of traumas are traumatizing events are used to create rulers, but can also lead to abomination or madness. And Metzger with his conspiracies connects all of this to ritualistic grooming and intergenerational trauma as tools for real world dominance, right? For this sort of detached dominance. And so, we see this Dune is science fiction epic, but it's kind of a mirror to these like real world hierarchies of groups that prioritize their bloodlines and manipulation and emotional numbness over what we would think of as regular humanity, right? And so I think you see in Herbert and Metzger this kind of warning that this elite engineering, even if it's meticulously planned, can't escape the hubris of trying to do it in the first place. That these mechanisms that are designed to secure, continued ongoing power, actually just really fracture the human spirit. They breed tyrants. They don't breed saviors like they're trying to do in Dune. They just sort of ensure that this cycle of control and collapse just maybe keeps happening, right? And that this is probably still happening, sort of hidden away in the corridors of influence and power in our own world, and it's still very much something that is affecting all of us. Anyway, yes, right. Yeah, I'll try and do that, Dulark. Thank you for commenting. But yeah, so that's all I've got to say about Kurt Metzger and Frank Herbert. I had another section I was thinking of doing about Candace Owen talking about Erica Kirk and her background. And there was another guy. What's the name of the guy? Is it Pete Hegseth? And he was going to sue people because people said that his girlfriend was a honeypot. Was it him? And I was thinking of doing that, but I think I've said enough. I think if you've watched this far, you've probably you get the gist of it. But anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Take care. This is it. No more Dune videos. The next video will probably be more Korean literature. So thank you and take care. All the best.